All right, I'm going to go ahead and move us into the main topic for today. Today's main topic is fantasy versus sci-fi.
Versus.
That's right. I should have.
Saturday night.
Can you give us a full, pre-fight intro?
I want Jared to.
In this corner.
In this corner, we've got science fiction, gadgets, and other tools from the future. And in this corner, we've got fantasy, dragons, gnolls, goblins, and other folks here to teach you lessons about life and family and the heart.
That was way better than I expected. And I'm glad you passed it to him because you would not have done that.
I'm sorry that I'm like this.
The benefits of having an actor on the couch. It took
out.
you about 1.5 seconds to just breathe and then commit. That was fun to witness.
Gotta commit to the bit.
All right, I'm gonna read a couple definitions that I found. Did anybody else find definitions of these two so that you can?
I found like 60 definitions, so
All
I
right.
can sort of talk about my feelings on all of them.
Okay, so simple. I'll read a couple and we can kind of go from there. So. Fantasy. Fantasy is a genre of speculative fiction involving magical elements, typically set in a fictional universe and sometimes inspired by mythology and folklore. Okay, that's the one I grabbed for fantasy.
Nice and simple.
Science fiction one's a little bit longer. Science fiction, often called sci-fi, sorry, I didn't need to read that part. Everybody knows that. Is a genre of speculative fiction whose content is imaginative but based in science, relies heavily on scientific facts, theories, principles, which is what makes it different from fantasy, is what this definition said. So while the storylines and elements of science fiction stories are imaginary, they are usually possible or at least plausible, according to science.
Podcast over.
That was a good one.
Okay. So I would say what's interesting from our team specifically is like our two major product lines. One is more in the fantasy world and one is more in the sci-fi world. And so I feel like you two, who have both done quite a bit of writing on those projects, maybe have some good insight into the differences in world building and storytelling in each of these genres. Do you have a favorite to work within? Jared, would you rather kind of work within world building and storytelling of sci-fi or fantasy?
I think fantasy, because I think in fantasy, oftentimes we are dealing with a simpler, quote-unquote, time, but with new and exciting elements. Whereas in sci-fi, oftentimes like the mundane problems of today are solved, but we have unfortunately created 1,000 more problems for ourselves. And I think that fantasy has a certain level of just like universal optimism that I really like.
Okay. What about you, Tom?
Not universal.
I don't have a preference. I like working in both. I think because for me, we could get into all the academic breakdown of what makes them different, and I think those summaries were pretty good. But for me, story is story. Story is about things happening to people and those things changing them. And I think that, generally speaking, both science fiction and fantasy take a slightly different approach to letting us examine our humanity, like what it is to be a person, and our culture, and what it is to be a culture or in a culture. But they both give us the opportunity to do those things sort of outside the direct reality that we live in. So we shed some of the current baggage. Mm-hmm. We can talk about ideas without having to deal with a politician we specifically don't like. We get to cast that aside to just deal with things on a more pure conceptual level and deal with things about ourselves and our beings on a conceptual level without the constraints of modern society. So I like them both.
So the constraints of plausibility in sci-fi don't bother your ability to do that storytelling?
No, because again, storytelling is about the people. Mm-hmm. And, to me, broadly speaking, and I think to most people consuming it, unless you're really you're super into science, so hard science fiction is what's really interesting to you. I think generally speaking, at this point, for most people, the difference between science fiction and fantasy really is just an aesthetic. Mm-hmm. do I want this space stuff with technology, or do I want something that's a little more like organic and fantasy, magical suspension of disbelief stuff? But as far as telling a story, like, you're still telling a story about people experiencing things. It's just in a different, the difference between science fiction and fantasy is the difference to me in setting. And, it's the difference between telling an urban story and a rural story. Like, it's just different stuff around the people.
Is that because, is it because Tom's smart enough to, like, make the science make sense without too much work? I feel
I'm not.
I wasn't
No.
asking you.
Definitely.
I looked to the other couch intentionally.
I'll shush.
Definitely not. No, it's not. It's not Tom
It's
being
not
smart.
that. I don't know. I feel like as I'm
kidding.
writing and doing world building, it's like those constraints. I do feel those constraints in sci-fi versus fantasy. Fantasy feels like anything is possible, and sci-fi feels like you have to be able to rationalize what you're doing in a different way.
Yeah, I think that one of the primary differences is the expectation that we have, like, not only for the characters but for us walking away from it. That in a science fiction story, by the end, all of the forces at play, all of the factors going in, the scientific facts, the gadgets, the alien races, whatever. All of them, that whatever is causing the problem can be and will be understood by the end.
Mm-hmm.
But in fantasy, the important lesson could be learned or goal be accomplished without the characters or us having any sort of semblance of understanding of, like, why things were happening, and still have it be satisfying.
Mm-hmm. What's the attraction to each of these? Fantasy and sci-fi are such big genres, and we can talk later about whether or not they should be separate or in one genre, really. But is there a specific attraction to each type of storytelling? My thought was that maybe fantasy is more of an escape, while sci-fi is more of kind of like an inspiration, because it's so much about what's a possible future or what's a possible past in sci-fi, I feel like. And so that makes me imagine what could be, whereas fantasy is like an escape from what is. That's how it feels to me.
As a writer, asking myself what could it be is the primary question that I'm asking in both situations,
Regardless of the genre.
Yeah, that in sci-fi, you're putting us in the future, a different planet, different, laws of physics, and then asking, what if, how are those things going to affect the situation? But in fantasy, there's no codified list of magic powers and crazy beasts and stuff, and so, like, that stuff can be much more ethereal.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious Krista's thoughts on this part, because Krista, you really enjoy Star Trek, but you are, like, a fantasy creature, and so, like, what is the appeal, and is there a difference to the appeal?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, actually thinking about this topic really kind of brought me into that, because I do consume and create in both of those.
Yes.
And I don't really think of the distinctions so much. And, because they, as Tom was describing really well, like, they both are a way of expressing these themes. And I guess certain themes work better in this kind of magical sense where it's these inexplicable forces, and then others, like how we perhaps relate to one another as a society, or other themes that we're tackling like that just kind of naturally come out through sci-fi more. But that is something that actually now I'm really thinking about, because I don't draw that distinction between them in my own mind.
I just wonder, I think about your process for creation and how you will go out into the forest and you'll observe something, and I sense that that's easier for fantasy than maybe it is for sci-fi, because you don't have spaceships you can go look at and get inspired by necessarily, unless I guess you do it just through media. It's just different than observing the spirit of a thing that's alive in front of you and being inspired by that.
Yeah. Well, and I think we can get like the sci-fi, the natural forms can inspire that as well.
Mm-hmm.
And also just like our societal, like things that we encounter in society, I think translate super easily to science fiction.
Mm-hmm.
But I cut you off, sorry.
I was just going to say that I think a lot of science fiction writers, they just like geeks about a different thing than Krista is. Krista likes to go out in nature and really like absorb and like extrapolate physical existence. I think a lot of people that write hard sci-fi have that same sort of drive, but it's toward like science or technology or culture, where they'll look at like, here's the trajectory of science, here's the trajectory of a technology or of the way we're behaving as a culture, and then say, okay, well, let's play that out to some extreme and see where it goes.
Yeah, that's a different research process, big time, I think.
But it's a similar research instinct, I think, to what she's experiencing in the forest.
It's just what it is that you're researching.
Yeah, she thinks, what if this piece grew 100% larger and this piece grew into it and whatever, whereas, someone researching culture would say, what if this piece grew larger? What if this prejudice grew larger or whatever?
I guess that makes sense too. When I think back to Unsettled, we're still exploring concepts, and it was trust we were looking at, from with a sci-fi lens, but it was group trust, and so it was observing humans as in groups that was how that was born.
We can scientifically explain every single thing in Unsettled. No doubt.
Okay, I'm going to push you on that. So are you trying to say that this idea of being constrained by real science wasn't something that was taken into consideration?
I would argue that Unsettled is not
Based
pure
in
science fiction. I think that's total space fantasy. We did not sit down with Unsettled and say, like, how can we extrapolate technology and culture and creatures and biology to come up with totally realistic things that could be. That is not the case on Unsettled. There are a bunch of crazy things that we just were like, what if this crazy thing? Which I believe is fantasy.
So you wouldn't call Unsettled sci-fi, you would call it space fantasy.
If we're going to get into some like rigid academic breakdown of what Unsettled is and these definitions, I would say that it is more fantasy. It is a space-themed fantasy title. It is aesthetically what we usually associate with science fiction, but it's more of a fantasy from these rigid terms.
Makes sense.
Sure does.
I don't like it though, because it like goes against some of my structure here. So you're blowing up my structure a little bit.
Well, that I think is kind of what's interesting about where we're going next, where we talk about like
whether or not they should actually be separate genres. Okay, so let's talk about that. They're both under this genre of speculative fiction, and is that where they should live more than having these subgroups? Is sci-fi really just space fantasy, and is fantasy just sci-fi we don't understand yet?
I mean, I think it's interesting to ask, like, what is gained by subdividing them and what would be gained by eliminating those subdivisions.
Right.
And I think those definitions are valid. Like the idea that science fiction is something that could plausibly happen, and fantasy is something that, based on our current understanding of the universe, could never possibly happen. And obviously some of that is subjective. Like, some supernatural things depend on your beliefs. Could angelic beings coming down to the world happen? Some of us think yes, and some of us think no. So like there's no like hard line of like, this is exactly how you box these things in.
And would that angelic being be Krista with wings,
or would it be John Travolta,
or a blue whale?
Yeah. But I think breaking things down is helpful in some ways because it lets you find more of what you're into, which is neat. I really like this thing, and I think things get even further subdivided. Like, I really like steampunk, Victorian, whatever, because you want to have more of what you like, and it's cool to get more of what you like. But the flip side of that is, I think, like, that was more useful 20, 30 years ago. Now, with the amount of technology available to us,
and just like the sheer amount of content that's
it is
available to
not
consume.
hard to find the exact same thing over and over and over and over and over again, almost to the point where I feel like the subdivisions hurt us,
maybe silo
because
us.
it's I think we box ourselves into where we're not experiencing new things because we say this is the lane that I like, and it's so easy to stay in that lane.
Not every. A lot of the modern video game commercials are just interspersed a couple of quotes, but the like big words, open world RPG, multiplayer, like these catch-all terms, roguelike, and 4X, all these different like genres
that
and
speak to like the corner that
yeah,
maybe
exactly.
a niche
It's like so in the
enjoys.
first 10 seconds of this video, you've heard the 5 words in order so that you know what this is supposedly. And yeah, I think that these categorizations help us find more of the same. I mean, in the modern parlance, I think that fantasy means so much more than just like, oh, it couldn't happen to a lot of people. It specifically means swords and shields and wands
Sure.
and dragons and so on. And that like culturally, that aspect of it like plays a big part because that's what your average person thinks of when you say fantasy.
It's the aesthetic.
Yeah.
But I do think it would be really neat, even if just for like a decade, like somehow all of these subdivisions were eliminated and it's just fiction. Like, because ultimately a story is a story. A story is about people experiencing something. And unless you're like super, again, like I am a scientist that really wants to read hardcore science fiction, that I don't even care about the characters. I'm just into the speculative paper that's being written here. Like, other than, people who are really entrenched like that, which is a very small subset, I think, of the audience for these things, I think it would be neat for people to expand themselves a little bit and find that, like, what we're really enjoying are stories about people. And,
or personified creatures.
Yeah, but that still, personified creatures still says something about our experience that we're attracted to, or that we're interested in, or we're curious about, or we need to, like, empathize with, and there are a lot of people who are reading or watching their lane who don't even remotely consider exposing themselves to these other things, but that would find stories there that are really powerful to them and expand their horizons a little bit. And I think we have really, really, really hampered ourselves, particularly in the last decade, with not letting our horizons be expanded, which is sad given how much stuff exists now. Like, more stuff exists, and yet we see so narrow a thing. And it would be cool to see that, because like a really good fantasy story doesn't do a whole heck of a lot that a really good science fiction story doesn't do, that a good like detective story doesn't do, a historical fiction story doesn't do, or just straight up modern standard fiction literature. Like, it's still just a story about people. And I think we do silo ourselves too much. I think it hurts us.
I keep trying to kind of fight you in my mind where we're wanting to make this more of under one genre, because I think to myself, I don't want to expand my horizons. Like, I love sci-fi. And maybe you did challenge me a little bit, because maybe it's not sci-fi, that maybe it is space fantasy. Maybe it's the theme more than it is the genre that I like.
Well,
I'm drawn towards stories about space and other worlds and space travel.
Well, and part of the reason that we read or watch movies or play games is because of the comfort that it brings us. And we do, like, if we have a certain relationship with a certain aesthetic, like, that is comforting and that's valid. There are people that just really like Westerns because there's just something about the feel of that space that feels really cozy to them. Like, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't also find a Western type story that takes place on a ship called Firefly. Like, there's
I do love that one.
there are lots of opportunities for us to find things we like outside of the vibe that we feel like is where we're just sort of locked into, because that's where our comfort zone is.
Yeah.
Wasn't the ship called Serenity, but it was
Yes,
a Firefly
thank you.
class vessel?
Thank you. I would have been so ashamed 20 minutes from now when that occurred to me. Thank you. Good save.
No problem.
Okay, but are we allowed to? Is it okay that I have a favorite?
Yes.
Okay. Do you have a favorite to consume?
I prefer fantasy.
You do?
Yeah. As far as, like, if I'm just going to sit down and read something, I typically prefer fantasy. If I'm going to, like, the things that I find myself visually attracted to, though, is typically science fiction. So, like, I like a science
Interesting.
fiction poster more than I like a fantasy poster, but I like a fantasy book more than a science fiction book, typically. But generally, like, I read all of it because I really just like stories. I also really like, film noir, and I like detective stories, and I like any sort of fiction about characters has something for me.
I think that's a great Tom quote. Any sort of fiction about characters, I'm here. I'm here for it.
I mean, unless it's really terribly done.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. But
Do either of you two feel like you have? Does this conversation make you want to get rid of the subcategories and kind of have them be in one main category, or do you like the subcategories?
I think I'm kind of having like the opposite experience. Like I naturally just like similarly with music, like I don't have a genre that's my genre. If there's something that has like that heart or core or theme that I really attach to, I attach to it in any genre, and I don't really draw those lines. But this conversation is making me think, okay, what of the things that I really enjoy are in each of these categories? And an interesting kind of pattern I'm noticing is that I tend to consume a lot of science fiction, and I'm guessing maybe the reason for that is that perhaps it has a propensity for, like, a lot of it explores those kind of psychological themes with a depth that I really like, whereas fantasy sometimes, obviously not all the time, but sometimes there is a tendency for like makers of media of that to like see these incredible like surface level things like you know, like the breath of a dragon or all these things that are visually really interesting and cool, but then portray them in a way that doesn't have that depth
and
beneath
nuance
them, which of course great fantasy has that depth, and I love that. But for some reason, yeah, I do notice that a lot of what I watch tends to be sci-fi.
I forget what I read a couple years ago, some sort of book on just literally like the existence of science fiction and fantasy. And one of the things it talked about in it was that science fiction and fantasy and horror, like all those speculative fiction genres, historically, in book form, sell terribly. Like, it's a niche market. You know, James Patterson, like standard, like regular thriller type books or romance books or just like, you know, regular books sell infinitely more than these genre books. Movies, on the other hand, all of the most like highest grossing movies, generally speaking, are fantasy and science fiction. And
That's fascinating.
the theory there was that like
The visual.
is science fiction and fantasy lends itself to special effects.
Interesting.
And
yeah.
so like but that most science fiction and fantasy movies compared to books are very shallow. It's just like, here's cool special effects. Whereas books like go really deep in all this other stuff and you can't see it other than in your head. And so there's like this exact opposite experience in the two
How
mediums, which I think is interesting too.
Do that dance move one more time.
It's like this.
Yeah, I like it.
Tom in the club.
Okay, well, this is an interesting conversation. I feel like maybe my favorite genre is now space fantasy. You've converted me.
I think
to
a
the
lot
concept.
of people will agree with that. One thing that I always find really interesting too, to just like stop you from closing this down,
I see what you're doing.
is inside of fantasy, like there are these sort of subdivisions of just how much suspension of disbelief is required. You know, because so you like with magic systems. There's an author named Brandon Sanderson whose magic systems are always really well explained. They're magic; they could not happen in this world, but in that world, he explains them scientifically. Like, human beings are capable of ingesting metal, and then depending on which metal they ingest, they have this new ability, and it's very intricately explained. So then when they're having combat or whatever, you can follow exactly what is happening. Like, okay, he just pushed that metal away from him, so that thing went flying because it had metal in it or whatever.
Yeah.
Where, you know, so that's sort of this like science approach to magic.
Yes.
Whereas then you switch over to like Lord of the Rings, and it's like Gandalf can just do whatever the heck he wants because he's magic.
Or Harry Potter, where we're just pointing as hard as we can at each other.
Yeah, and that's never scientifically explained. Like, there's no rules to how that works that we could like, you know, make a chart.
Yeah, we just see the beam and we're like, okay, I guess they're winning. Okay, I guess they're winning.
Right. Oh,
There's
they're
some
doing the
sort of-
beam harder.
Yeah.
Like,
Oh, I adore you.
anyways, but that's where we could get in the weeds more. But
All right. Shall I pull us out of the weeds? We could talk forever, but we're not going to.
we do have another episode to record.
Yeah. This is my job to close us down, so we're going to close us down. I'd love to hear other people's feedback. Is space fantasy your favorite too? And if so, what are the space fantasy books that you're reading? Because I want to hear more about them. If you have topics that you want to hear us talk about, we would love to hear that at orangenebula.com/topics. Leave us a review if you like us. Leave us alone if you don't. That's it. Stay inspired, expand yourself, or don't. We're not in charge. Bye.
Bye.